Who's winning the drone wars in Ukraine? I think that will determine a lot of things. Well, good news, I got a reporter from Ukraine who's going to talk to us about it right now. Patrick Hillsman, he's a journalist and researcher focused on arms trafficking and refugee issues, Syrian conflict, drug policies, written for Quartz, Alternate, Vice News, Daily Beast, Christian Science Monitor. He was part of the Al Jazeera documentary, The Search for Assad's Executioners. So Patrick, welcome, and tell us where you are right now.
Glad to be here from Lviv in Ukraine.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions, including who's winning the war and how you know by some of the experiences that you've had in Ukraine. But before we get there, one of the things I'm curious about is everyday life in Ukraine, because some of the cities are completely bombed out. Some of the cities are relatively untouched. Some of them are partially bombed. What are people doing? Are they mainly going about their lives? And how do you go about your lives in a situation like that?
It's strange because there's a huge difference between the quality of life in the West, where I am right now, and in the East, where I was 2 weeks ago in the cities of Kharkiv and Zaporozhye. There's a different architecture, there's a different lifestyle there, and also there's a different level of danger because those cities obviously in the East are closer to the front lines. And it's also important to point out that a lot of them are Russian speaking predominantly. So there is sort of a linguistic divide. But what's interesting is that I think Putin probably expected a lot of the Russian-speaking cities in the East to support him, and instead they've defied him. And as a result of this, as the Ukrainian army has pushed back Russian advances, there's been a lot of indiscriminate shelling and bombing of these cities, almost as if to punish them.
Well, there's probably a number of reasons that might be among them, and obviously to take them is another reason why they're getting pummeled. But Patrick, any sense of why those Russian-speaking, partly Russian ethnic population cities are so devoutly fighting against the Russian invasion?
Well, there's definitely some percentage of the population that has sympathies towards Putin or did, but it's not the norm. And I think that they're probably fighting against him because they've seen what he's done to the rest of the country and they've seen how he's been bombing them. I spent some time in an apartment block in the city of Zaporozhye, which is not too far from Mariupol in terms of Ukraine. And there were air sirens constantly. And the majority of the people who live there are Russian speaking. And it was as though they were under siege from an enemy. And it was clear that these are not people that are going to join the cause of Putin. They were preparing for war.
Yeah, there is a great irony in Putin bombing areas with more Russians. So, and it's not Russian citizens, obviously, but people who speak Russian and might be ethnically Russian. And so he's, in a sense, he's probably killed more people who are ethnically Russian than Ukrainians. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm just saying, given where he's bombing. So Patrick, you're gonna talk to us about that too, but I wanted to also ask the question. So given what's happening on the ground now, what we're hearing from the outside is that the Russians have begun to withdraw from the West almost entirely and focusing completely on the East. How true is that? And what do you think that foretells?
Oh, it's completely true at this point. They clearly were trying to at least encircle Kyiv, and they got pushed back completely to the border with Belarus. And they've been trying to take Kharkiv. They've been trying to take Zaporozhye in the east. They were trying to essentially bisect the country, and it's clear that has failed. And as a result, you've seen sort of these indiscriminate strikes that have happened. And I'll tell you an interesting story: is that me and my colleague Paweł Kwiecin, a Polish reporter, went by ambulance. We drove 1,300 kilometers out to Zaporozhye. Then we went to Kharkiv, and then we drove approximately 1,300 kilometers back. We had to sleep in the car at one point. It was a really interesting road experience. And the morning we got back in Lviv, all the way to the west, 1,300 kilometers, there was a cruise missile strike that blew up a tire shop, a garage, and struck the train station, and it killed, I believe, 7 people.
Yeah, and so is it fair to say that unless something dramatically changes, that the idea that Putin seemed to have in the beginning with that giant 40-mile line of tanks that were coming to encircle Kyiv, that he has basically at this point in the war given up on the idea of taking all of Ukraine?
I'm not sure what he's thinking, obviously, because the motivations, it was a stupid thing to do in the first place, but it seems pretty clear that the advance has at least been stopped. But there's a lot of damage that he can still do because he has a gigantic army, he has an air force. Neither side controls the airspace, which is very unique in modern warfare. Interestingly enough, as we were traveling east, we saw what initially I thought was a Ukrainian jet, but then immediately after it flew by, there was an air raid alarm. So it was likely a Russian jet. And that was fairly deep within Ukrainian airspace. So it seems that they're still trying, they're still flying missions, but they're definitely getting beaten back in a lot of areas. There's areas that border Russia directly, and then there's Mariupol, obviously, where they've been able to essentially obliterate cities that are on the front lines, and they're able to make progress that way. But this sort of blitzkrieg maneuver that they were probably trying just didn't work.
Okay, so that leads us to the drone wars. And you've covered this before too, but it looks like we have this strange situation where it's the Turkish drones versus the Israeli drones that are fighting this war between Ukraine and Russia. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You essentially have two very bad human rights violators that are providing the drones for both sides. You have the Bayraktar drone coming from Erdogan's Turkey, and then you have the four-post drone, which is coming from Israel, but going to Russia. And it's a lot of people have found it rather curious that the Israelis actually helped upgrade the Russian drone arsenal. And these Israeli designed drones and Israeli licensed drones are being used to target Ukrainians. And they're overtly releasing video of this happening. And it's very interesting. There was one that was shot down or that came down a couple weeks ago, and it had the IAI, which is Israeli Aircraft Industries logo on it. So it's not like this is something that's hidden. But it's an interesting situation where you have sort of a classic war in the sky, but with new technology. And the world hasn't seen this. There's a potential for it to go really bad.
So Israel is against Iran and Hezbollah, but Russia is in favor of Iran and Hezbollah. Yet Israel is arming Russia. Turkey is a NATO ally, but on the other hand, Erdogan's pretty good allies with Russia, but he's arming the Ukrainians. It's almost as if the only thing that any of them care about is the money.
The money, the prestige. There seems to you always want to scratch each other's back if you're authoritarians. It's an interesting situation. The Israelis claim to have stopped providing drone parts to the Russians in 2016, but that was 2 years after the occupation of Crimea. So they were complicit in what Putin is doing in Ukraine. And there's a possibility that they're still providing parts. The Israelis recently declined to comment on whether or not they were providing upkeep for the Russian four-post fleet.
So the Bayraktars, those are the Turkish drones, have done massive damage to the Russian army, and so have the Javelins made by the US. So for all of our fancy aircraft carrier and nuclear subs and F-35s, it's like two of the simplest technologies that's doing all the hard work in these wars. So given how well that has worked, which is surprising, right? That it's done so much damage to the second largest army in the world. Yeah. Is there any chance that Ukraine actually flat out wins this war and Russia completely withdraws without taking any more of Ukraine?
I don't know about taking it or not, but I think that they'd be able to hold the territory that they have pretty effectively in a lot of cases. And I have a piece coming out tomorrow on Offbeat Research that explores the drone wars, which you could sort of look at as a microcosm for the greater war. And the war on the ground is obviously different, but it's hard to beat an entrenched army, which is something that Russia learned the hard way when they tried to encircle or take Kyiv and essentially bisect Ukraine. And if Ukraine moves into the east, there's a high potential for them to experience heavy losses trying to push back the Russian forces. And then also that adds the increased risk of there being civilian losses in those areas that have been occupied by Russia. So it's very important that people put pressure externally on Russia to try and make that fight as quick and as as unharmful to the civilian population as possible, because we need this war to end with Russia losing. But the more pressure we can put that isn't through violence, the better. It's better for everybody if Putin can be isolated, and if the occupation of a sovereign nation and people can be halted through pressure, because doing it through fighting is going to be incredibly costly.
So one thing I've always wondered is Mariupol looks like it's just completely bombed out, and I can't believe there are any civilians left there, but apparently there are some. I can't get a good sense of what percentage of the civilians have left that city, and if the Russians take it, to your point, they will entrench themselves with their troops. It'll be hard to retake. But what I keep wondering is, to what avail? Like, to what point? You take a city with almost no civilians left in it, why'd you bother taking it?
I guess you could look at it as like as part of toxic masculinity of dictators, or just thinking that they need to take something in order to claim that they have had some sort of victory. It's hard to understand why, but I think that probably they just want to show that they've taken something so that it's not completely humiliating for them. Because in military terms, it's been humiliating for Russia.
Yeah. So last two things real quick. You saw a lot of refugees when you were stationed in Poland, and obviously also within Ukraine. At this point, has there been have most of the people who wanted to get out of Ukraine already gotten out of Ukraine? Is everybody else staying, especially in the West, that is less war torn? Or what's the current status right now?
A lot of people have moved west. So the percentage of Russian speakers has increased in the Western areas, and it's very interesting. Also, a lot of the NGO workers who I've been speaking to were planning on evacuating people from Ukraine to third-party countries like Ireland and France. And what they found is that some people are returning because the Ukrainians have been successful in pushing the Russians out of the Western or certain parts of Ukraine. So right now they're working on a strategy to help accommodate the refugees from the East here in the West.
All right, Patrick Hillsman reporting from Ukraine. Thank you, we appreciate it.
Great talking to you.